The following is a scientific hypothesis and solution set that other people are welcome to test and scientifically validate. Part E, Oliver Stone and the Jews in Daltex, Zapruder and Luce Auditorium 1978, 15 years later. There were a lot of Jews occupying the Daltex building in 1963. David Weisblatt, Morty Friedman, Russian Jew Sam Bronfman, who owned Seagram's, Zapruder, and the Dallas Uranium and Oil Company. Zapruder filmed the assassination. Immediately he sold it to Henry Luce for $150,000. It was developed at Kodak Dallas, and then it was altered at a CIA facility in Rochester, New York on Saturday or Sunday night. There were possibly 4 Zapruder films made, 1 original and 3 copies. Edgar and Edith Sulzberger Stern of the Wall Street Journal and Sears Roebuck were friends of Clay Shaw and owners of the WDSU station that ransacked Garrison's case in 1967. You shall not circulate a false report. Exodus 23:1. i.e. from the Warren Commission. There were a few performances I attended at Henry and Claire Luce Auditorium, Dumaguete, Philippines in 1978, but I didn't know the Luces would crop up again later in my life. Was my dad a 1954 periodic CIA agent with extra pay and tasks? I don't think that thought really occurred to me until a couple of months or days ago. It might not be accurate. Lots of people go to Albuquerque, the Bahamas, Montreal, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Heilbronn, and Honolulu, don't they? Then again, my mom was bright-eyed and sprightly 5 days before her organs started shutting down, and she died 3 years ago. It sounds a little like a biological warfare hit to me. She was cremated, no autopsy. The JFK movie was directed by a Jew in 1991. On the heels of Carpenter's They Live movie in 1988, to be an awesomely plotted and executed movie that blames a lot of people, but silently tries to throw the scent off of any Jews. Part F, Fear and Trembling, and the Composite Man. The birth of the Talking Oswald Evangelical Church might have started on July 12, 1484, with Georgus Helmstetter. On June 27, 1528, Dr. Georg Faustus von Heidelberg, Faust, from Helmstadt near Heidelberg, was a trickster and fraud who joined the new Protestant movement. In 1600, the Jewish Pappenheimer witch trials took place a little further east in Bavaria. Some poor itinerants, not named Pappenheimer nor Pappenheim, were scapegoated as the cause of all sorts of unsolved crimes and other problems, and were disgustingly vilified by the good Christian prosecutors and townspeople. Marguerite Oswald once commented she used to read Ulysses with my friend Pappenheimer, now at Harvard, and I had been a student at the University of Heidelberg. Possibly Michael Paine's legitimate or illegitimate birth was the cause of the Great Depression, so the family made a Celtic sacrifice to the gods. W. Giles Thomas appears to be some sort of fake marriage to Ruth Forbes in the early 1940s. George Lyman Payne Jr. buried Sutton Island, Maine, and Ruth Forbes married in 1926. The divorce date is fluctuating. Francis Drake Payne headstone on Sutton Island, Maine, 1912 to 1999, is probably Margaret Forbes, with a homage to Brit Sir Francis Drake. Ruth Forbes' brother William Hathaway married Anne Pappenheimer on 12/31/1935. Is she also buried in Maine? Francis Drake Payne, aka Freddie or Freddie, lived 1911 to 1999 and appears to have had some sort of fake marriage to Michael Payne's dad, George Lyman Payne Jr. George divorced Ruth in 1934. George Lyman divorced in 1934 because Margaret was pregnant and needed a husband. Margaret became Frances Drake Payne to give birth to Cameron Forbes Payne, or Lee. The Now Shun Trust was formed on May 2, 1932. John Edward Pick, the name he had always gone by, probably had a New York, Now Shun, Boston, or Maine dad. John Pick never saw his father, Edward John Pick, an Albert Jenner question. John lived at 325 East 92nd Street, Manhattan. Rodman Clark Rockefeller lived 1932 to 2000. John Edward Pick lived 1932 to 2000. In a young three-boy Oswald photo, John looks like the 45 Margaret with Mr. Ekdahl. John learned from a Life magazine article that Ed and Marguerite were separated when he was born and divorced later in 32 or in 33, was told his real dad was a railroad porter and former pro basketball player. John Pick's live-in dad, when he was 2 years old, Marguerite's second husband, was called Lee Oswald. In 1952 in New Orleans, there were two sets of Marguerite Oswalds and kids living in nearby neighborhoods. There was a 5'0" Marguerite Margaret living with a Lee Oswald character. There was also a 5'6" Marguerite Margaret living with a Robert Oswald kid, and perhaps with a Cameron Forbes, aka Lee kid. The 5'6" Marguerite might have visited her son John at 325 East 92nd Street in Manhattan in August 1952. However, she was maybe pretending to be the 5'0" Marguerite in order to frame her in the future. John later said he didn't feel a motherly love towards the 5'0" Marguerite, but that is probably because the 5'6" Marguerite was his real mom. As mentioned previously, the 5'0" Marguerite might have been Margaret Emma Keating. When 5'6" Marguerite and her son Cameron, Lee, visited in August, John had a cheerful meeting with his real younger brother. John lived at his mother-in-law's apartment with his wife Margaret or Marjorie Dorothy Furman, birthday December 21 or 22, 1933, who was one of 7 kids. Marguerite made a comment that John was better than his wife. This would maybe be a comment that a Forbes, Cabot, now Shun Island daughter would make. Furman could also be an alias. Any chance that John married one of the former Hungarian president's daughters? After a staged argument, Marguerite got kicked out of the apartment. John re-enlisted and he and his wife moved to Portsmouth, Virginia to live with John's wife's sister, Emma Parrish. John said, "My wife liked Lee. It would be nice if Lee would stay with us alone, and we wouldn't mind having him." Any chance Marguerite left Lee with John and his wife and headed back to New Orleans by herself? 6 years later, in 1958, John and Robert had another argument with a Marguerite Oswald, this time in Fort Worth, Texas. John then left for service work in Japan. Was Lee with him? And he said he never saw Marguerite again. Switching gears, there is a Jewish story about Abraham deciding to sacrifice or kill his son Isaac. Kierkegaard did an extremely in-depth analysis of this story in Fear and Trembling. It's not that far of a stretch to suggest that fear and trembling could have been taught in German universities such as Heidelberg in the 1920s, though Kierkegaard is not responsible for the JFK assassination. Philosophers don't kill people, guns do. Did Ruth Forbes Payne Young give up Cameron to the Mafia, who was replaced with a Genesis 2213 Ram or Scape Sheep, Alec, whom Jack Ruby killed? Or was Margaret Forbes, mother of Cameron and sister of Ruth, likewise given to the Mafia, where she took a role as a New Orleans CIA Avon and shoe salesperson? Would June Oswald, not born in June, legally be a merging of the Mafia and Forbes families? Or else would it be an arrangement where the CIA and or the Mafia protect the Forbes and other people like them? Blackmail is a Scottish word that means protection from pillage. Lee Harvey Oswald is a composite man. Robert Lamont Chase, Manhattan Bank, had a wife named Mary who wrote a 1944 play called Harvey about a giant make-believe bunny. There was also a 1927 cartoon called Ozzie Rabbit, which was Cameron's Lee's nickname. Oswald has an English origin that means God rule. Os, Latin for mouth, and wald for wield authority. Don't confuse Oswald with Orwell. How many fingers am I holding up? Lee is also English, sheltered or protection. Lee Cameron became chosen to play a part in the Scape Sheep plot. Governor Connally was Secretary of the Navy in '61. Then Fred Korth who was a lawyer in Marguerite's 48 Ekdal divorce as Francis Drake. There's an unidentifiable park picture in New York that could be the Minsk Oswald, but he is not the one Rubinstein shot. Or is he? Is Bruno Mancuso the doctor who delivered Cameron? Robert and Cameron probably had a New Orleans dad, or maybe just Cameron, or maybe neither. Why in 1956 does the New Orleans City Directory list both Marguerite Oswald and Margaret Keating, both living at 120 North Telemachus, both former wives of Robert E. L. Oswald, a wedding on 11/1/1920 with no kids? Both sides of Michael Payne's family, Cabot and Forbes, owned land in Cuba that was expropriated by Fidel Castro. Those damn commies. Any chance Nelson Rockefeller impregnated Ruth, bore Michael, who flunked out of Harvard in '49? Any chance Nelson impregnated Margaret, who bore John? Any chance Nelson impregnated Polly, who bore Robert Heidel? Is Francis Drake Payne Margaret Forbes? Is Cameron Forbes Payne Lee, whose dad is Nelson or some other New Yorker? Cameron said on 12/27/1963 that he lived in New York City from 1941 to '47. He did not see much of his father, even though he also lived there. John Foster Dulles, brother of Allen, contracted the 99-year United Fruit Company of Boston's Cabot and Cabot Guatemalan arrangement in 1936. Nelson Rockefeller was sworn in as President Eisenhower's special assistant in charge of super-secret Cold War strategy and psychological warfare in December 1954. He announced his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination on August 10, 1963. The Brazilian Institute of Democratic Action was funded in part by Cabot, Cabot, and Cabot's First National Bank of Boston in the fall of 1963. Alwyn Max Pappenheimer Jr. of Cedarhurst, New York, died at an unknown location, was the son of an unknown father and unknown mother, was the husband of Pauline Forbes, married in 1937, at an unknown location with unknown children. Anne H. for Hathaway Miller Payne is Cameron's wife and is also buried in Maine, or is Anne H. Miller an alias for Anne Pappenheimer? Alwyn Pappenheimer is Anne's dad. Polly married Alwyn legitimately in '37. Big age difference, maybe more legal marriage than loving. Did Pauline Forbes Pappenheimer have a daughter? Not Vada Oswald? Yes, Anne Pappenheimer or Anne Miller? Did some Jewish Bavarian Pappenheimers change their name to Rockefeller? There is also a Mary, mother of Jesus, Pauline Forbes Johnson, from Boston and from Maine, adopted by Harriet and Harriet. Polly Forbes' daughter? The online genealogy indicates this poor person is related to the stories. I smile inwardly quite a bit when I read about myself. I smile and say, "Oh goodness, how can you be so wrong?" Marguerite Frances Claverie and Ed John Pick were married on 8/1/1929 in Harrison County, Mississippi. Both Senator Ford and Robert Oswald experienced uneasiness when Michael Paine was taking an oath to tell the truth, or when Robert received a weak, distant eyes, fish-like handshake. According to John Pick, "Well, sir, the Lee Harvey Oswald I met in November of 1962 was not the Lee Harvey Oswald I had known 10 years previous. Ever since he was born, and I was old enough to remember, I always had a feeling that some great tragedy was going to strike Lee in some way or other." Cameron Forbes Paine is Lee Oswald. Alec, the man Ruby shot, is the Wicker Man, 1973 movie. The most spiritual aspects of the case. If you research the life of Jesus Christ, you find that you never did hear anything more about the mother of Jesus, Mary, after he was crucified, said 5'0" Marguerite. He died in the service of his country. My son, Lee Harvey Oswald, even after his death, had done more for his country than any other living human being. John Pick, speaking of the 5'0" Marguerite, John, who is a Forbes, whose god is money. All she cared about was getting hold of and making some money. This is her god, so to speak, was to get money, and to get as much out of me as she could. Marguerite married Edward Pick 8/1/1929, shortly before Polly was 17. Did Marguerite begin at a New Orleans law firm shortly before she was 17? Or are the stories being mixed and matched? Ed Pick did not want children and would not support her. He supported John until he was 18. He tried to fulfill his responsibilities and obligations dutifully. Marguerite and first husband divorced amicably after a year on Genoa Street. Margaret was very pretty and had a very happy childhood. Nelson Rockefeller, VP under Gerald Ford, was 3 years younger than Margaret Forbes and 3 years older than Pauline Forbes. Maybe Pauline helped Sister Margaret with her pregnancy, and then Margaret also helped Pauline with hers. My sister was taking care of Lee permanently, from age 2 to 5, at 831 Pauline Street. A question was later asked to 5'0" Marguerite. "Do you think your sister," they said this to my sister, "do you think that your sister has hallucinations?" Nelson Rockefeller destroyed Frida Kahlo's friend's Diego Rivera's Rockefeller Center mural in 1934 for being too socialist and too anti-capitalistic. His son, Michael Rockefeller, disappeared or was eaten by cannibals in 1961. Mary Todd Hunter put up with Nelson Rockefeller's illegitimate children living separate lives until she finally got a divorce in 1962. Nelson married younger, happy Margaretta Murphy on May 4, 1963. Nelson Rockefeller died in 1979 at age 70, when I was living in the Philippine Islands, in the company of 25-year-old Megan Marshak at a townhouse on 54th Street, Manhattan. It's possible Nelson is my dad's hero. He's 93 now, but he used to say he wanted to die when he was 70. This presentation on how long United States citizens will be prevented from seeing the remainder of all of the JFK assassination classified files is a matter of national security. It is a serious matter of the security of the people in this nation who have all the money. Plus all of the fiduciary assets hidden in Switzerland and in Panama and in the Bahamas, e.g. Deltec holdings, that are difficult to detect, hidden in legal but fraudulent trusts.